In 1787, America was falling apart. Farmers were rebelling, states were fighting, and the dream of freedom was slipping away. Behind locked doors in Philadelphia, 55 men gathered, not to patch the old system, but to secretly create an entirely new government. What happened inside that room was full of conflict, betrayal, and compromise. Yet from their struggles, a legacy was born that still shapes our lives today. This is the untold story of how America forged its Constitution. In the summer of 1787, the city of Philadelphia buzzed with heat and tension. The streets were alive with horse-drawn carts rattling over cobblestones, children darting between markets, and merchants shouting their prices. But inside the walls of Independence Hall, the air was heavy, not with commerce, but with uncertainty. The United States was only a few years old, and already it was on the brink of collapse. The Articles of Confederation, the fragile system of government holding the states together, had proven to be a weak foundation. Trade was chaotic, states quarreled like jealous siblings, and the national treasury was nearly empty. Farmers were revolting in Massachusetts, merchants were desperate in New York, and whispers of division spread across taverns and town halls. The dream of independence was slipping into a nightmare of disorder. 55 men, representing different corners of the young nation, gathered in Philadelphia with a mission that would test their ideals, their patience, and their very understanding of freedom. These were men like George Washington, who carried the weight of leadership with a quiet dignity. Benjamin Franklin, aged and frail yet sharp with wit and wisdom, and James Madison, a small man with an enormous intellect who believed words could bind a fractured country. They came dressed in wool coats despite the sweltering heat, their hair powdered, their eyes wary, their pens ready. Each man knew that history was watching, and the outcome of their work could mean survival or ruin for the Republic. Outside the hall, ordinary citizens speculated. Some feared the men inside would crown a king. Others prayed they would bring stability to a nation drowning in confusion. No one knew for sure what would emerge from the closed doors, because secrecy was the rule. Windows were shut tight despite the suffocating summer air, and guards were posted outside. The delegates had agreed. Nothing would be spoken of until the work was done. This was more than politics, it was a gamble. Could men who had just broken free from one empire now design a new government that balanced liberty with order? Could 13 fiercely independent states surrender just enough power to create unity, without smothering their freedoms? Every man in that room carried his own answer, his own fears, his own ambitions. The Constitutional Convention was not destined to be smooth or harmonious. It would be a crucible of ideas, a clash of egos, and a test of loyalty to something greater than personal gain. From this gathering would rise debates that shook the very definition of democracy. There would be moments of brilliance, moments of near collapse, and moments where betrayal seemed to hang in the air. Yet from these heated struggles a legacy would be forged, one that would shape not just America, but the idea of governance for centuries to come. When the delegates first assembled in Philadelphia, there was no clear plan, no single vision that united them. The only certainty was that the Articles of Confederation had failed. Under that system, Congress had no power to tax, no authority to regulate trade, and no means to enforce its decisions. States acted like miniature nations, issuing their own currencies, negotiating their own trade deals, and sometimes even threatening one another with militias. America was free but fractured, and everyone in that hall knew it. Into this uncertainty stepped James Madison of Virginia, a young man barely 5'4", quiet but relentless. He arrived with notebooks filled with ideas, sketches of governments, and careful study of ancient republics and modern states. Unlike many, Madison did not come to patch the Articles, he came to replace them. His Virginia plan proposed a bold new national government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It was a plan that shocked some and inspired others. As he presented his ideas, a ripple moved through the chamber. Some delegates leaned forward, intrigued by the prospect of a stronger union. Others stiffened in their seats, hearing in Madison's words the faint echo of tyranny they had only just escaped. Yet his proposal planted a seed. For the first time, the delegates began to imagine that they were not there merely to repair, but to build something entirely new. George Washington, presiding as the convention's president, lent his silent but powerful support. Washington spoke little, but his very presence gave weight to the proceedings. The man who had led the army to victory now sat at the head of the room, his calm demeanor reminding the delegates that this was not a game of politics. It was the future of the nation. Even those who disagreed with Madison's boldness could not ignore Washington's steady hand. In these early weeks, momentum began to build. Committees formed, drafts circulated, debates sparked like fire in a dry field. The delegates argued over representation. Should large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania dominate? Or should small states like Delaware and New Jersey have an equal voice? It was a question that cut to the heart of fairness and power. Though the arguments grew heated, something extraordinary was happening. For the first time, men from across the states were thinking not as Virginians or New Yorkers or South Carolinians, but as Americans wrestling with a shared destiny. Outside the hall, citizens speculated endlessly. Rumors swirled that a king would be chosen, or that Congress would be abolished altogether. But inside, the delegates pushed forward. Franklin, old and weary, often reminded them with gentle humor that compromise was the only way forward. When a broad table is to be made, he quipped one afternoon, and the planks do not fit, the artist takes a little from both and makes a good joint. His words softened tempers, allowing the work to continue. The rise of the convention was not marked by agreement but by determination. Despite their divisions, the delegates understood that failure was not an option. To leave Philadelphia without a new framework would mean chaos, perhaps even disunion. Slowly, painfully, a vision of a stronger, more balanced government began to take shape. The United States, fragile and uncertain, was beginning to rise from the ashes of its broken system. The early momentum of the convention soon gave way to storms of argument that threatened to tear the gathering apart. The heart of the conflict was representation. How would the voices of 13 wildly different states be heard in this new government? Large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania wanted representation based on population, ensuring their greater numbers translated into greater influence. Smaller states like Delaware and New Jersey, fearful of being swallowed whole, demanded equal footing no matter their size. The debate grew bitter. Delegates pounded tables, raised voices, and accused one another of scheming for power. At one point, tempers flared so high that some threatened to walk out. It was as though the fragile experiment of unity was already breaking under its own weight. The New Jersey delegation put forward its own plan, a direct challenge to Madison's Virginia plan. It called for a single chamber of Congress, where each state would have one vote, just as under the Articles of Confederation. It was a plan rooted in fear of domination by the larger states, fear of losing identity, fear of being left behind. To the big states, this proposal was unacceptable, a step backward into the very weakness that had paralyzed the nation. Beyond representation, other conflicts boiled. Should enslaved people be counted in population tallies? Southern states demanded it, knowing it would increase their power in Congress even while they denied those same people freedom. Northern delegates bristled at the hypocrisy, refusing to grant political leverage based on human bondage. The question of slavery hung like a storm cloud over the hall, too divisive to resolve cleanly yet impossible to ignore. Economic interests clashed as well. Merchants from the North wanted strong federal control over trade to protect their shipping and manufacturing. Farmers and plantation owners from the South feared such power would lead to taxes that favored one region over another. Each side spoke with urgency, as though their livelihoods and their futures depended on every line drafted. Inside the sweltering hall, with windows shut tight to keep out prying ears, the air grew thick not just with heat but with mistrust. Delegates wiped sweat from their brows, tempers frayed, and yet the arguments pressed on. At times it seemed as if the convention might collapse altogether. Men muttered about returning home, about letting the fragile union splinter apart. And yet, amid the shouting and frustration, there were glimpses of hope. Franklin once again reminded them that perfection was impossible, that unity required sacrifice. When you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, he warned, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion. It was a sobering truth. They were not just building a government. They were wrestling with their own flaws. The conflicts of the convention were fierce and personal, but they were also necessary. Through struggle came clarity, and through argument came the outlines of compromise. The road ahead was uncertain, But one thing was clear. To survive, the United States would need not victory for one side, but a fragile balance between all. As the debates dragged deep into the Philadelphia summer, alliances shifted like shadows in candlelight. What began as unity and purpose began to fray under suspicion and bruised pride. To many delegates, the fiercest betrayals were not acts of treason against the nation, but personal wounds, moments when colleagues abandoned shared principles for compromise, or when loyalty to state outweighed loyalty to country. The sharpest sting came with the Great Compromise. After weeks of deadlock, it was proposed that Congress be split into two chambers, the House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, where every state would have equal representation. To some, this was salvation. To others, it was betrayal. Delegates from larger states who had fought hard for proportional power felt abandoned. Small state delegates, once ready to bolt from the hall, now smiled with satisfaction. The compromise saved the convention, but it left scars of resentment. Even deeper wounds opened with the question of slavery. Southern delegates insisted that enslaved people be counted toward their population numbers, giving them more seats in the House. Northern delegates balked at the cruelty of granting political power through human bondage. The result was the 3/5 compromise, an agreement that each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a free person for representation and taxation. To some in the hall, this was a practical solution. To others, it was a moral surrender, a betrayal of the very ideals of liberty that had inspired the revolution. Men who had fought side by side against Britain now accused each other of hypocrisy. "How can you speak of freedom while chaining men in bondage?" one delegate demanded. The Southerners bristled, replying that their economy, their very survival, depended on slavery. In the end, the convention chose survival over principle, binding the nation together with a compromise that betrayed the enslaved and planted seeds of division that would one day erupt in civil war. Not all betrayals were written into the Constitution. Some were whispered in private, carried in gossip from taverns and inns. Delegates feared that secrecy was crumbling, that words spoken in confidence were being carried outside. More than once, Washington's stern gaze silenced rumors, but the suspicion lingered. Trust, already fragile, was strained further. There were even those who felt betrayed simply by the convention itself. Patrick Henry, a fiery voice of independence, refused to attend, declaring, "I smell a rat." To him and other skeptics, the convention was not forging liberty but forging chains, central power that could grow as oppressive as the monarchy they had escaped. When the draft of the Constitution was finally revealed, some who had once been hopeful now felt their fears confirmed. Where were the guarantees of individual rights? Where was the promise that government would remain the servant, not the master? The convention had survived betrayal, but only by swallowing bitterness. Every compromise carried a cost. Every concession left someone wounded. Yet the delegates pressed forward because to walk away would mean national collapse. They chose to sacrifice trust and purity of principle for a fragile union. But beneath the ink of the Constitution, the stains of betrayal remained, faint but permanent. When the convention finally adjourned in September 1787, the delegates emerged pale and exhausted, their faces lined by months of heat, argument, and compromise. In their hands they carried a document, imperfect, contested, and fragile, that would define the future of a nation. The Constitution was not a work of harmony but of survival, hammered together by men who often distrusted one another, yet understood that disunion would be fatal. On the final day, as the last signatures were scrawled across parchment, Benjamin Franklin, too weak to stand, offered a quiet reflection. He pointed to the carved sun on the back of George Washington's chair. "I have often looked at that sun," Franklin said, "without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising, and not a setting sun." His words captured the moment, a fragile hope that the new government would not descend into failure, but rise into something enduring. Yet outside the walls of Independence Hall, the battle was not over. The Constitution still needed ratification by the states, and fierce opposition awaited. Critics called it a betrayal of liberty, a step toward monarchy disguised as democracy. They demanded a Bill of Rights, fearing that without explicit protections the government could trample individual freedoms. The debates raged in newspapers, taverns, and town squares, dividing communities and testing loyalties. Still, one by one, states signed on. Some did so eagerly, believing in the promise of a stronger union. Others joined reluctantly, bargaining for amendments that would guarantee the rights of the people. It was a victory not of unanimous joy but of careful persuasion, fiery speeches, and a growing realization that survival required unity. The legacy of the Constitutional Convention is not a story of perfection, but of endurance. The men who gathered in Philadelphia were flawed, many blind to their own contradictions, many bound by self-interest. They compromised on slavery, leaving behind a wound that would fester for generations. They left questions unanswered, trusting the future to resolve them. And yet they achieved something extraordinary. They built a framework strong enough to guide a nation, yet flexible enough to adapt with time. The Constitution they forged became more than a legal document. It became a symbol, a promise that governance could rest not in kings or conquerors but in the consent of the governed. It inspired revolutions abroad, influenced thinkers across oceans, and proved that a republic could endure. For the delegates, their legacy was mixed, praise for their courage, criticism for their concessions. For the nation, the legacy was clear. From conflict, compromise, and even betrayal, a new government had risen. The story of the Constitutional Convention is not only about the men who wrote the words, but about the generations who would live by them, challenge them, and expand their meaning. From that sweltering summer in Philadelphia, a fragile union emerged. And against all odds it endured. From the sweltering halls of Philadelphia came a document born not of unity, but of struggle, compromise, and sacrifice. The Constitution was never perfect. It carried scars of betrayal and left questions unresolved. Yet it survived, outlasting its authors, guiding a fragile republic into a lasting nation. Its legacy reminds us that democracy is not built in harmony, but in the courage to argue, to compromise, and to believe in something greater than ourselves. The men of 1787 gave us more than laws. They gave us a framework of hope, one that still challenges us to rise, to confront conflict, and to carry the promise of liberty forward.